Over the last century, animation has grown from a small collection of imaginative art projects shown primarily for children into a booming global industry with high consumption rates and influences in most media. Looking back, we can see how the two world wars affected a fledgling and fragmented animation industry and how it pushed each region into its own artistic direction. Here I will be discussing the different ways countries that now major in the world of animation were affected by the conflict, observing how the spirits of the people still influence animation depending on the circumstances of its post-war economy. For either world wars, while each country had its own unique style relevant to its own artistic and historical influences, the animation industry looked very similar globally. Simple cartoon animals on comedic, episodic adventures. During the First World War, this little form of art began seeing changes at a rate different than before. America began surging ahead, and we find characters developing that are still recognized today, such as Betty Boop and Mickey Mouse, with the 1920s to 30s being considered the beginning of their golden age of animation. With the start of the Second World War came massive change. While in most cases studios were reduced to minimal staff or disbanded altogether, those that changed with the times survived and even thrived. Studios with established popular characters began to create work containing propaganda. Warner Bros., for example, was contracted to make a short, adult-focused series called Private Snafu, the main focus of this character being to motivate troops and show the negatives of doing things wrong, hence the show's name being an acronym for Situation Normal, All Fouled Up. Animation thus became an engaging way to entice and lull audiences into certain political opinions, including young children, in the form of special episodes with their favourite characters, such as Daffy Duck and Bugs Bunny. Use of propaganda in children's entertainment is now considered morally corrupt and is a reputational risk for studios. Disney made considerable profit off such propaganda, however it wasn't celebrated by the studio. Walt stated, "I don't like this profit during war, when people are out there giving up their lives." However, propaganda still persists in modern animation, in more subtle forms of tongue-in-cheek jokes and playful banter, as seen in things such as Family Guy and South Park. After the war, this trend spread across participating regions, each reflecting and resulting in the mood of its audience, whether the winners or the losers in the conflict. Themes range between those of pride and heroic victory from US studios to the dark and melancholic offerings from those of Japan and Russia. During these times, most animations were marketed for children or at least designed to visually appease them, making them an audience for animation that covered adult themes. America strived forwards in the light of new opportunities, though not without the struggles of funding and public interest. By the 1950s, America moved into its own silver age of animation, with Disney's 1950s Cinderella being the highest-grossing American film of that year. American works began to reflect the American dream, popular ideas of freedom and heroism being shown to an audience of children not growing up having seen the war, thus carrying the sense of superiority into future generations. Thus, films based on natural-born heroes who prevailed over one-dimensional villains were popular. The art style was colourful and beautiful, paired with grand music and happy endings. This happy ending style reflected the country's post-depression, post-war booming culture and economy that still persisted until recently. Now, however, it's beginning to be critically considered as an outdated cliché, with predictable plots and characters. This, of course, with some exceptions. It did persist throughout more recent conflicts, such as during the Vietnam War. This was a politically unpopular and unsuccessful conflict, however, America made no changes to their prideful genre. The animation at this stage was a lot larger, and the war affected the day-to-day lives of most Americans far less. Meanwhile, countries that suffered more from the cost of war spent a lot longer recovering their animation industry and created animated works with overtones much darker and more depressing. Japan's animated sector had been in the early stages of growth. In the 1920s, it was too poor to afford supplies such as celluloid and consisted of just over 100 experienced animators. Thus, they had no means of catching up to Americans' level of cel animation. However, creativity and invention prevailed. They began to excel at cutout animation under the guise of masters such as Yasushi Murata. Eventually, they did advance to cel animation just before the major conflicts began. However, Japanese freedom of expression in animation had suffered due to government censorship and control, enforcing cultural nationalism at the start of World War II. Animators survived on the production of propaganda shorts such as Momotaro's Sacred Sailors, which idolized the Japanese military and portrayed Americans as a national target. CDT creates writes, despite the controversial nature of these animations and their reasons for being, the wartime propaganda mills allows Japan's animation industry to take root before ultimately evolving into the medium that we now know as anime. Japanese studios began, however, by following American trends, creating characters such as the iconic Astro Boy. By the 1960s, the industry had grown enough for the masters to begin using their own styles, using the now cheaper equipment and resources. It also began to produce its own beautiful animations with stories and metaphors that directly reflected the state of the nation. I imagine working on animation that depicts the pain that you and your own family had suffered through resulted in this drastic display of artistic direction. Passion in showing the world your own pain could be a key as to reasoning why, in this time, the standard production of animation was so high. Productions such as Shonen Ninja and Kimba the White Lion showed elements of Japan's newly developing cute art style, with large eyes and big-headed characters generally used much darker tones in its animation. For example, Abandoned Little Cat Tora is on the surface about a baby cat going through a tough adoption, but is actually reflecting on the fate faced by thousands of Japanese orphans due to the war. This tone continues in the development of anime, perhaps most well recognized in the works of Isao Takahata, who was influenced by his own father's account of the war. In his work, Grave of the Fireflies, the story of two orphaned children by the war struggling to survive alone, the story ultimately ends in tragedy. Both America and Japan suffered and caused suffering during the war, but the different attitudes shown by each arguably still persists in their animated films today. In particular, tragedy is still very prevalent in Japanese animation, coming out in beautiful, vulnerable pieces of art, with more layers of depth than the average American production by most people's standards. The impact of the World Wars was perhaps reflected most starkly in the output of the animation industry in the Soviet Union. After the conflict, Russia was in a heavy state of economic and social depression. While underdeveloped in the 1920s, mass funding was given in 1933 with the intention of growing its influence overseas. The industry would initially grow, but in times of suffering for the Russian people, brought on by the Cold War, which was deep into play, the animation productions took a very dark and melancholy turn, paired with tragic music and somber plots. Even productions aimed at children and meant to be light-hearted had a sadness to them. The Hedgehog and the Fog and the legendary Tales of Tales being particularly dark and depressing examples, with previously unseen and complex animation techniques used such as photographica. These sorts were deeply poetic and cultural to Russian folklore and remain well-known staples of Russian art. I spoke to a peer raised in post-Soviet Latvia, and she states, "I believe that Soviet animation continued to be so popular due to reliability. Due to the war and the abrupt changes for many countries, kids could no longer escape reality to a make-believe one. Instead of distracting from their pain, the bleak and hopeless narrative soothed and generalized what everyone was feeling as a collective." The Soviet Union's animated output most closely reflects the spirit of its people at that time. This could be due to a lack of censorship leading to the freedom of expression, unlike in Japan, and a lack of need for larger funding, like in America. David Remus writes, "I would suspect that Russians who grew up watching Soviet animation feel a sense of superiority and national pride over modern cartoons made in America, which they may view as being immature, narcissistic, and capitalistic, with a lack of true artistic value." In the modern day, Russia still produces beautifully unique animations, with its melancholy chimes still echoing. Considering each region affected by the conflicts has such different levels of censorship and different outcomes within the conflicts, we have seen that the national spirit of the time has had an impact on studios, animators, and audiences, and ultimately changed the course of animated works across all regions. Whether conscious or unconsciously directed, stories, metaphors, styles, musics, techniques, and intended audiences have all been affected. In all cases, we can observe how the audience in each country favours their own respective artistic viewpoint on conflict and its after-effects. It is important to note with all three examples used, the animation studios did still produce a few works that escaped these genres, such as Russia's No Pogdi, a Tom and Jerry-like comedy that was, and still is, very much nationally loved. However, when looking broadly at each time relevant production, the genre of post-war works are always personalised and circumstantial. Behind all these different circumstances, we can see a connection. Each nation we looked at follows the same pattern of using animation to either influence or reflect people's emotions, connecting people in a shared experience, whether painful or pride-filled.